The episode begins with a great hero who faced off against the Demon Lord in an epic battle. The Demon Lord tried to taunt the hero, saying that if he failed, the world would come to an end. The hero, left with only a small rock, used it to destroy a giant boulder the Demon Lord had hurled at him. Tired of the games, the hero was determined to end it all. Both sides used their most powerful abilities, engaging in a final confrontation. After numerous clashes, they were left exhausted, and in a desperate act of mutual desire, they stabbed each other and collapsed. Fast forwarding to the future, we meet a happy young boy named Blade, who is excited to join school. He notices how students greet each other and longs for a normal life with friends. Blade, unaware of his heroic past, eagerly introduces himself to everyone, aiming to make 100 friends. As he makes new acquaintances, Blade meets a group of students, including Cassim, Clay, Jessica, and Claire. He happily befriends them but is later approached by a girl named Ernest, who questions his commotion. Claire explains that Blade is a transfer student at Rosewood Academy, a school that trains heroes, and he should follow the rules. However, Blade's carefree attitude prevails, and he introduces himself with a smile. Ernest, known as the strongest student, remains unimpressed, but Blade remains cheerful and unfazed. Ernest remains unimpressed and argues that the school only accepts those who aspire to be heroes and shouldn't accommodate late admissions. Blade, however, is not concerned about becoming a hero. His primary goal is to make friends. This attitude sends Ernest into a fit of frustration, as she believes Blade lacks the determination to protect others. Undeterred by Ernest's outburst, Blade asks her to lead him to the principal's office. Once there, Ernest bows in respect upon seeing the principal's face, but Blade casually engages in conversation with the principal. Ignoring Ernest's protests, Blade maintains a relaxed demeanor. Ernest even tries to warn Blade about the principal's true identity, but Blade is unfazed and acknowledges that he knows who the principal is. To Ernest's surprise, the principal reveals that he is, in fact, the king and had taken on the role of the school principal after being recommended by the previous headmaster. Ernest's loyalty to the king is evident as she heaps compliments upon him, but the king playfully interrupts her boot-licking. He then requests a private conversation with Blade, and Ernest reluctantly leaves the room, upset that Blade treats the king so casually, like a casual friend. Blade, feeling frustrated by the whole situation, confronts the king and questions his presence. The king reveals that Blade lost his powers after the battle with the Demon Lord and wants him to regain his hero abilities. Blade, however, is annoyed because he just wants to be an ordinary person. But the king dismisses his desires, referring to the school as a rehabilitation center for Blade and explains his plan to create great heroes like Blade was. Back in class, Blade tries to talk to Ernest, who is in the S class. She questions why he is there, and he explains that he took the exam for F classes but was told to come to the S class. Ernest accuses him of cheating and bribing his way in, emphasizing that this school only accepts wholehearted individuals. Unfazed, Blade is determined to make 100 friends and starts introducing himself to everyone around. Ernest is irritated by his actions, but when Blade pats her head, she becomes shy and tries to attack him. Blade dodges her attack with ease. Another student named Sophie intervenes, and Blade introduces himself twice, but she ignores him. Ernest then clarifies Blade's intentions, and Sophie suggests testing his abilities. The instructor is hesitant, but Blade's determination impresses them. They bring out an enchanted metal armor and challenge Blade to slice through it, as S-class students can easily achieve that feat. Blade questions the different levels of strength, and Sophie explains that there are at least 3 levels above the rest. Impressed by Blade's skills and fighting spirit, everyone around notices that he possesses the rarest and strongest Dragon Series spirit. He demonstrates his powerful Dragon Eater skill, which not only crushes the enchanted armor to dust but also unintentionally affects Ernest and other students. Blade, realizing what happened, apologizes, claiming to be an ordinary person. The class ends, and during lunchtime, Ernest eats alone in her usual spot. Blade decides to join her and invites his friends, but they decline. Ernest explains that the table is reserved for her, but Blade misunderstands and asks if she's being bullied. She calls him an idiot and reveals that everyone is afraid of her. Curious, Blade wonders why, but she ignores his question. Blade begins eating his meal enthusiastically, and Ernest is puzzled by his excitement over simple curry. She apologizes for her earlier assumption that he bribed his way into the school, but Blade doesn't even remember that situation. Ernest admits that he sees some talent in him, but Blade is solely focused on enjoying his food. However, he thanks her for helping him realize his dream of making friends. Later that night, Ernest reflects on their conversation. At first, she calls Blade an idiot, but then she happily rolls on her bed, excited to have made her first friend. However, she is reminded of her past when she felt a strong connection to her sword. The sword begins shaking, evoking memories of the sword instructing her to surrender herself to it. Ernest was drawn in by the sword's influence, and as she picked it up, her hair changed from black to red. The sword's words urged her to destroy, slash, and burn, but Ernest resisted and told the sword to be quiet. She knew she was destined to be the next head of her family and wouldn't succumb to the demonic sword's temptations. Ernest managed to calm the sword down and became determined to grow stronger. The following day, they resumed their practice lessons, but Ernest felt annoyed with her opponent's lack of seriousness. He seemed like a playboy, not wanting to hurt a lady. However, he activated the power of his lance, impressing Blade, who rushed forward but was thrown away like Team Rocket. The opponent conceded defeat with a playful expression. Suddenly, Ernest lost control and was about to harm him severely, but she managed to stop her swing just in time. She then called for her next opponent, Sophie, and the two engaged in battle. Despite Ernest's attacks, Sophie blocked them with her punches and even pushed her back. Sophie admits defeat after Ernest uses a fire skill against her. Blade is then called to fight Sophie, but he's concerned about her well-being. Sophie assures him that she's fine and gets into her stance, but suddenly, she drops her sword and faints, feeling the sword's dangerous influence. Blade catches her just in time and takes her to the infirmary. Blade pleads with the doctor to help Sophie, just as she had helped him after defeating the Demon Lord. However, the doctor explains that she cannot do anything against spells and curses. When Ernest wakes up confused, Blade tries to explain, but she gets startled. Blade intervenes and clarifies everything to Ernest, who wants to leave, but the doctor advises her to rest. Blade promises to take care of her and helps her get back. Ernest insists that she can walk on her own, but Blade offers his support, emphasizing that they're friends. Ernest requests him to keep the incident a secret and walks away. Blade decides to investigate the Academy's data system to learn more about Ernest. He discovers that her sword is named Asmodeus, a demon sword that gives her immense power, but also poses a danger as the sword has a will of its own and doesn't accept her as its master. Blade calls Ernest out for a private conversation, and she misunderstands his intentions, thinking it's romantic. However, he reveals that he knows the secret about her sword. Outside, Ernest explains that she found the sword at a young age, and it has been trying to take over her body since then. She's been fighting to resist its influence. Blade suggests that the only way to stop it is for the sword to acknowledge her as its owner, but Ernest is afraid of the consequences if she fails. Blade reassures her that he can handle it and promises to destroy the sword if necessary. Ernest decides to trust him and starts the ritual to form a pact with the demon sword. Blade watches as flames surround her body, and after finishing the chant, the demon sword increases the flames to test her. Ernest confronts the demon, commanding it to submit to her authority. However, the demon refuses and forces them into a fight. The flames generated by the demon give rise to small demons seeking to destroy everything. Blade steps in and easily defeats one of the demons with a powerful punch. Witnessing Blade's strength and support, Ernest gains confidence that he will take care of everything if she fails. Thus, she decides to give her all and engages in an all-out battle against the demon. With Blade's encouragement, she manages to win the battle and gain control over the sword. Blade catches Ernest as she falls from the sky, congratulating her on her victory. From that moment on, Ernest changes her ways and starts greeting students with a smile instead of being moody, all thanks to her first friend, Blade. As the day continues as usual, class starts, and Blade practices against two students. He skillfully dodges every attack, impressing Ernest. She approaches him and suggests that he should at least draw his sword when sparring with his colleagues, expressing that he appears disrespectful by not even looking at them during the fight. Blade teases her playfully, saying she looks different. Ernest acts flirtatious, asking him how she looks different. Blade recalls all the moments when she smiled and acted cute. Eventually, he admits that he doesn't know. Another student, Leonard, joins the training and continues the sparring with Blade while mentioning that he should notice when a girl changes her hairstyle. Amusingly, Blade hadn't even noticed the change. Ernest feels a bit down, remarking that she didn't expect him to notice. However, she returns to her serious demeanor and instructs Blade to keep an eye on Sophie, another student. Ernest explains that Sophie usually practices alone and follows every command, except for the times when she interacts with Blade. Following Ernest's orders, Blade approaches Sophie, introduces himself, and says that Ernest asked him to watch over her training. Sophie asks if it's a command when Blade offers to help her. He clarifies that it's not an order but simply because he wants to be of assistance. Blade smiles and expresses his intention to teach her other ways to fight. When Sophie reveals that she was only taught to use her fists, Blade promises to show her how to use weapons if she's interested. Blade assures Sophie that he's trying to help a friend and emphasizes that she doesn't need to learn if she's not interested. However, Sophie is curious and decides to give it a try. They prepare to practice together, but the bell rings, signaling the end of their practical training. Blade gets flustered, thinking they were flirting, but Ernest corrects her. In the next practical training class, Blade teaches Sophie how to use a sword. Although she struggles to cut through the armor initially, Blade encourages her to channel her fighting spirit into the sword, just as she does with her fists. He explains that a sword is an extension of her body. Sophie quickly grasps the concept and manages to cut through the armor. Blade concludes the training session for the day, but Sophie asks if she will be able to defeat Ernest in the future. Blade replies that reaching Ernest's level won't be easy. Suddenly, Sophie throws the sword back at Blade, but he catches it. Then, she grabs him and swiftly throws him to the floor. In the next moment, she sits on top of him to restrain him and comments that this way is stronger. Blade agrees and admits that he can't move. Sophie leans closer, explaining that it's important to have the upper hand in battle and wouldn't be in a good position if the enemy could move freely. Blade agrees, and Sophie expresses her desire to learn something else from him the next day. Blade promises to teach her. However, before that, he needs to visit the school principal, who is also the king. The king asks about Blade's school life, and Blade tells him that he has made some friends. The king feels relieved, recalling that Blade became a hero at the young age of 3. Despite considering Blade his best friend, Blade wishes to make friends his own age. The king asks about Blade's friends, and Blade mentions Sophie, with whom he has grown closer lately. The king is not surprised and comments on her strength but says she's still incomplete. Blade is confused, and the king explains that Sophie was part of the artificial Great Hero project. The goal was to create an artificial hero, just like Blade. They used ancient forbidden knowledge and experimented on a subject with the best aptitude, creating several clones of her for the experiment. Sophie's real name is Sophicia Femto, and she is the 12th clone, signified by Femto meaning 12. Blade is in disbelief upon learning the truth from the king. The king explains that Sophie, the original test subject, was treated as an object for experimentation. Blade gets angry, but the king assures him he wasn't involved and took down the organization responsible. The king took Sophie in and offered her freedom, but she still asks if that is a command. Feeling responsible, Blade rushes back, blaming himself for Sophie's lack of a normal life. He decides to ensure she gets her normal life back, but he doesn't know what normal means for a kid his age. He seeks advice from his medic friend, who teaches him about the vigor of youth and what's normal for his age. Next, Blade asks Leonard about what youth means and what it involves. Leonard is unsure and mentions love. Blade quickly goes around asking his colleagues about love and what people do when they're in love. They mention going on dates together. Blade visits Ernest's room, asking about dates, and though she misunderstands at first, she explains that it involves spending time alone, talking, walking around, and shopping. Ernest insists that they're not ready for a date yet, but Blade leaves, determined to go on a date. While looking for Sophie, Blade accidentally enters the girls' bathroom and asks Sophie on a date. She agrees with a smile, and the other girls, including Ernest, decide to spy on them, united to keep an eye on Blade and prevent any funny business. Sophie arrives on time for the date but admits she doesn't know what a date is. Blade assures her that he has everything planned. They go around the city, eat ice cream, visit spots, and play at an arcade. Ernest and the girls become a little jealous, as the date seems to be going well. As the day continues, Blade becomes a bit more romantic, and they share a drink with their straws. Ernest and the girls are a bit bothered by the closeness between Blade and Sophie. Sophie asks Blade to get closer to her, but he jumps away in confusion when their faces nearly touch. She wonders what's wrong, and he explains that his heart is racing faster than a race car. They shyly get closer again to finish the drink together, and Sophie tells him to get even closer. However, despite sitting at a table nearby, Ernest and the girls are annoyed that they haven't been noticed. As their date progresses, Blade begins to feel like someone is following them, but they ignore it and try to enjoy their activities. Blade notices they're running late, but Sophie assures him that taking a shortcut involving climbing a building and jumping among city buildings is fine. Later, they sit by a fountain, and Sophie admits that she had fun on their date. She asks Blade why he decided to call her on a date. He struggles to tell the truth and replies that it's because she's his friend. Sophie questions if they truly are friends, as friends don't keep secrets from each other. Feeling caught, Blade considers confessing, but instead, Sophie reveals that she isn't a normal human. She shares the story of being an incomplete test subject and shows off her powers, which she has difficulty controlling. Blade, feeling compelled to be honest, admits that he used to be known as the Great Hero, but he lost his powers. Sophie wasn't aware of this, but she felt something familiar about him. Blade apologizes, feeling responsible for her becoming a test subject. He explains that the hero's power is a curse, and he never wanted to be the great hero, but he had to fight because he believed he could use the power to save people. He recounts his early struggles and the times he couldn't save everyone, causing people to be angry with him. Moved by his words, Sophie comforts Blade and tells him to be proud of who he is. She reveals that after being rescued by the king, she went on a journey to discover her identity, acknowledging all the cities and people he had saved. They hold each other tightly, and Sophie expresses her pride in being part of the artificial Great Hero experiment because she wants to become someone like him. Blade decides not to let his past haunt him any longer, and the two promise to keep each other's real identities a secret as they hold hands. Blade and his classmates were enjoying lunch in the cafeteria when Ernest noticed food on Blade's face. Sophie kindly helped clean his face, causing Ernest to complain out of jealousy. New friends joined them, and one of the girls asked for Blade's opinion on their outfits. Ernest interrupted and congratulated them for being promoted to the S-rank class, where only S-rank students can dress freely. The ground started shaking, causing panic among the students. A dragon appeared, and Blade asked if it was the magical beast. He approached the dragon, and it became friendly towards him. Blade pacified the dragon with a single punch, revealing that it was just a baby dragon. Suddenly, the dragon transformed into a little girl who called Blade her father. He denied being her father but offered to help her find her parents later. Then Blade asked everyone where the dragon go. Ernest explains that the dragon turned into that little girl, but Blade thinks she is joking. But Sophie also explains to Blade that it's true and Blade trusts her words, which makes Ernest more jealous. Blade discovered that the dragon had transformed into the little girl. Then we see that a girl, whom they named Ku, clung to Blade and asked to play with him. They decided to let Blade care for her to prevent her from going on a rampage. Blade bathed Ku and explained that he chose her name after a strong knight who always kept promises. Suddenly Ernest barged in and was surprised to see Blade bathing. Then Ernest informed him about the nature of magical beasts and how they can take human forms if defeated by a human. Ku revealed herself after overhearing their conversation, and she liked her name. Ernest caught Blade taking a shower with Ku and kicked his face while calling him a pervert. The following day, Ernest was still annoyed, especially because Ku was sitting on Blade's lap and asking him to feed her. Blade obliged, but Ku mentioned that being fed by Blade made the food taste better. Claire found Ku cute and tried to feed her, but Ku became aggressive, refusing to be friends with weak humans. Blade reassured Ku that Claire was not a threat, but Ku insisted that Blade should pay attention only to her, calling him her father. She requested a good morning kiss and to sit on his lap during mealtime, to which he agreed. The other girls were shocked and asked if Blade kissed Ku in the morning, but he clarified that he never did. Ku then mentioned that Blade spends time staring at mature female bodies, which she found unacceptable. The girls took this seriously and confronted Blade, and even the boys seemed to be against him. Ernest recommended that their classmates not worry about him. Blade noticed Ku walking by and asked her to join him in training. She happily accepted, claiming she didn't need training, but since he asked, she would show off her power. Jessica expressed her wish to become a spy and asked who could teach her. Blade recommended Sophie, but Ku felt ignored and left. Later, Blade ran into Ku feeling down, and he inquired about what was wrong. She brushed it off, claiming to be hungry, and they went to get some curry. After their meal, Blade watched Ku fall asleep, and Ernest knocked on his door. They went outside, and Blade explained that dragons are tormented by their parents when they're born, as it helps the child recognize their parents due to their strength. Ernest asked if that was why Ku behaves the way she does, and Blade agreed. He expressed concern about Ku ending up truly alone in the world. Ernest asked if Sophie was reassured, revealing that she was listening to everything earlier. Ernest and Sophie were worried about Blade, but he assured them that things were going well with Ku. The girls headed back to avoid any scandalous rumors. When Blade entered his room, he noticed Ku was not there. He went to the roof and asked her what was wrong. Ku replies that looking at the moon calms her down, as she sees them as representations of a parent and child. Blade understands her feelings and asks if she wants to make friends. Ku denies it, stating that dragons are stronger than humans both physically and mentally, and they don't form friendships. She only needs her parent, Blade. The next day, Blade tries to make the king babysit Ku, but it doesn't go as planned, and Ku gets scared and runs off. Blade becomes frustrated with the king's approach. Later, Blade hears Ku's voice and sees her playing with toys, each representing a personality from one of his friends. Ku mentions names of students whom Blade has never talked to, making him realize that they are the other students they pass by while walking around. Blade notices that Ku has managed to create 108 friends through her toys. He understands that Ku wishes to have friends but claims she doesn't. He walks away, feeling disappointed that he never noticed her desire. Ernest approaches him, offering to help search for Ku, but she is stunned when Blade starts banging his head against the wall repeatedly. She stops him and asks what's wrong. Blade explains that it's challenging for Ku to make friends because dragons don't see weaker beings as equals. To be Ku's friend, they would have to defeat her in a fight, leaving Blade feeling powerless to help Ku find the friendship she desires. Ernest urged Blade to rely on her and others instead of trying to handle everything on his own. They made their way to meet the lower-class students and asked for their help in the fight. Blade talked about Ku, explaining her desire to befriend them and asking for their assistance in defeating her. The students knew they couldn't defeat a dragon, but Blade begged them on his knees to become Ku's friends. Ernest and the remaining S-class students also kneeled, asking Ku to finally make friends. The students couldn't believe their eyes and ended up agreeing with their requests. The next day, everyone waited for Ku's arrival at the arena. She came in her dragon form, and the king watched from afar, enjoying the scene. The secretary questioned whether a dragon would acknowledge defeat if taken down by a large group. The king believed it would, as human, unlike dragon, work in groups. The king felt sad because Blade wouldn't join the fight, but Blade almost told Ku that it's okay if she burned the king into crispy royal bacon. Instead, he patted her head and mentioned that she couldn't fight when she was captured due to a trap. But this time, there were no traps, and she could show everyone her strength. Ku breathed fire, and everyone prepared to start the battle. This brings an end to our episode. If you enjoyed it, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel, Annie Explainer.